conflict to community, meaningful actions that bring us together rather than tear us apart. I'm Russell Jeung, a board member of E4J. It's a sort of ragtag group of followers of Jesus who exactly want that for evangelicals to be for justice. We're really blessed today, and I actually do want to start off to acknowledge that I'm on Ohlone land in Oakland, California, and that I want to pay my respects to our elders, both past, present, and future. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Jesus and his spirit in our place and our conversation today, and invite you to also seek his blessing. We have 4 great speakers today, and they're going to talk about their responses to this anti-critical race theory movement. I just looked it up, and in the United States today, 37 states have introduced legislation regarding education and how race, history, bias will be discussed and taught, if it will be. And since it's now such a pertinent movement, often a movement driven by evangelicals, we thought it's important for us to discuss the issue and to figure out how faithful Christians can respond to it. We invite you, as you listen in, to put your questions in the Q&A box. And also, if you can, in the chat, put your name, your location, land, and maybe what you do. That'd be fun so we know who's in the audience. And if you want to become a member of E4J, and if you like this discussion, we have these discussions among ourselves monthly. In the chat, there's a membership form, a link that you could do to join the E4J monthly discussion group. And also, this event is free. And if you can donate to E4J so that we can continue to put on these stimulating conversations and meetings, you can donate at the PayPal link in the chat. I feel like a PBS host. So let me introduce the 4 speakers shortly in the order that they responded to me. And maybe as I read your name, you could wave and identify yourself. First, we have Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley. He's a farmer, activist, scholar, distinguished speaker, teacher, and wisdom keeper who addresses a variety of issues concerning American culture, faith, spirituality, race and diversity, regenerative farming, and our relationship with the earth and indigenous realities. Dr. Woodley and his wife are co-sustainers of the Eloe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and the Eloe Farm and Seeds Regenerative Teaching Center and Farm in Yamhill, Oregon. So let's welcome Randy. And next we have Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan. He's the Robert Munger Professor of Evangelism at Fuller Theological Seminary and author of The Next Evangelicalism, Many Colors, Prophetic Lament, and co-author of Forgive Us, Return to Justice and Unsettling Truth. So let's welcome Soong-Chan. Robin Afric, for the past decade, has been curious and committed to operationalizing concepts and frameworks of DE&I in traditional systems and industries. A thought leader, speaker, and author on the said topics, she's dedicated herself to becoming a practitioner of them, operating within corporate, for-profit, nonprofit, faith, and government sectors to affect change. Currently, Robin is adjunct at Hope College and the first director of a DEI for Ottawa County, one of the fastest growing counties in the state of Michigan. Let's welcome Robin. And last but not least, Lisa Sharon Harper leads trainings that increase clergy and community leaders' capacity to organize people of faith towards a more just world. A prolific speaker, writer, and activist, Ms. Harper is the founder and president of freedomroad.us, a consulting group dedicated to shrinking the narrative gap in our nation by designing forums and experiences that bring common understanding, common commitment, and common action. Ms. Harper is the author of several books, including Evangelical Does Not Equal Republican or Democrat, Left, Right, and Christ, Forgive Us, Confessions of a Compromised Faith, The Very Good Gospel, and just released Fortune, How Race Broke My Family. and how to repair a call. So let's welcome Lisa. I'll start with 4 questions that each of the speakers will address, and then we'll have Q&A. So as you go along, feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll address them afterwards. Unless you have a really good question, then I'll interrupt everybody and say, oh, this was a great point. And so feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we'll ask them. So our first question is, well, what is CRT and why is there such a big movement against it? And I think that will help be the foundation for us in our discussions today. What do you think is the source of the anti-CRT movement? So I'll start off with Soong-Chan, and then Lisa, then Randy, then Robin. Soong-Chan.
So yeah, I guess first crack at it. Is stupidity allowed as an answer? I'm sorry, no, that's, yes, I'm going to be good. I promise I'll be good. I just thought I'll start off with a joke. And that to me is maybe one of the foundations of it, which is, now I'm not an expert in critical race theory, but I have been called one on many different platforms. So that's always interesting to be given expert status on a topic you don't really know all that much about. But that's where my kind of, the anti-CRT feels like this creation of a straw man, straw creature, whatever you want to call it, and the subsequent negative fallout from that. And the way I've kind of tried to analyze this is, it's not the critical part that people are nervous about, because those you know, evangelicals use the historical critical method of analysis for scripture. That's the basic method that's taught in every evangelical seminary. You'd learn the historical critical method. So it's not the word critical. It's not the word theory, because by nature, theory shouldn't be frightening or anxiety inducing. It's a theory. So the word must be race that makes it so problematic. So the idea that conversations on race challenge some of the presuppositional norms within evangelicalism, particularly around exceptionalism, triumphalism, American Christian nationalism. These are all factors of this narrative that have been formed in American society, particularly around white evangelicalism, American greatness, American exceptionalism, the triumph of the American church, and critical race theory and the examination of racial history challenges these presuppositions and assumptions. And so these embedded narratives that are so difficult to uncover, once they get uncovered, there is a visceral, emotional response to it. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with critical race theory.
Thanks, John. Lisa?
Thanks so much for this awesome, first of all, this awesome platform and opportunity to talk into this question. I also give honor to the First Nations of the people who stewarded the land that I'm sitting on right now, the Lenni Lenape people of what we now call Philadelphia. And we offer blessings to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And so I want to say that critical race theory, what it is very simple. It was developed in the halls of legal academia back in the 1970s and 1980s. First by a man named Derek Bell, Professor Derek Bell, who was speaking into a conversation that was happening, particularly among liberals, among progressives, and they were saying that we need to really pay attention to Marx theory, because Marx theory is the theory that is actually, I mean, economics is really at the bottom of everything in America. And if we don't deal with economics, we're not going to heal America, and we can't have a just legal system. So Derek Bell actually looked at that and said, no, African-American man. He's like, actually, at the heartbeat of the American legal system is this construct called race. And yes, economics has something to do with it. But if you do not actually also include and see the depth of the reach of this construct called race, we will never heal America. We will never actually have a just legal system. So that's why he developed it. It was in conversation with Marxist thought. Now, the ironic thing is about the anti-CRT people say that Derek Bell was Marxist. He actually was not. He was not. He was doing the exact opposite. He was saying, look, Marx was a white guy in a white context. He could have a theory that is only about economics, but this is America. America is fundamentally about racial hierarchy in order to establish an economic hierarchy. But the first way they did that was through race. So that's the truth. That's what it is. And ultimately what the theory says is, in order, I mean, there's a thing called race. It's a legal construct. It's a political construct, as in it's created to determine how the people will live together, the polis will live together. And it impacts whole people groups. That's the theory. So now we know, we kind of say, duh. Of course that's true. But back at the time when Derek Bell developed the theory in the 70s and 80s, actually that was kind of a new thought. It was newly said because there had not been people like him in those halls to make those statements up to that point. So what do I think about the anti-CRT movement and its origins? Its origins stem from the same place, the same people that created the religious right in the first place, in the legal context. They created the religious right first in response to Brown versus the Board of Education. That's the roots of it. The whole segregationist movement, that's the roots of the religious right. And then after Bob Jones versus the USA, when they lost that case in 1983, they turned to the issue of abortion in order to win what they needed to overturn Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a shifting of the calculus of the Supreme Court. They needed a conservative Supreme Court, one that mirrored the ratio of conservative to progressive that was there during Plessy versus Ferguson. And guess what? They've been fighting for that for 40 years, and they got it. So the Supreme Court that we have right now is like the Plessy versus Ferguson court. And so people of African descent and other people of color and people of indigenous descent, we know what to expect whenever anything goes before this court. Never before in the history of America, in the history of the Supreme Court, has there ever been a ruling by a conservative majority that has protected the rights of people of color. Never. So the anti-CRT movement is really out to do one thing: to protect and continue to entrench white Christian nationalism.
Thanks, Lisa. Randy, I'm hearing common themes here. So Randy?
Okay, well, let me divert just a little bit. You know, the scriptures say perfect love casts out all fear. But unfortunately, perfect love doesn't make as much money as fear. And it doesn't keep politicians in power, and it doesn't keep particular preachers on the extreme right in power. And so I think anti-CRT is a red herring. It's meant to deflect us from something else. And it's fear-based movement, and it has become now sort of the latest evangelical bugaboo, if you will. I've read over a dozen different supposedly intellectual critiques of CRT, and my analysis is that the critics, at least all the ones I've read, do not understand it. There's been, numerous articles and interviews and church instruction seminars on how to stomp it out because it's from the devil, which is a sort of a common thing that happens in evangelicalism every so often. I remember Harry Potter. Don't read Harry Potter books at one point, but none have seemed to have been reasonable to me or represented it well. And I think you at least need to know a system before you really begin to condemn it. And it is a systems approach to understanding the role of race in society. And so, I've watched news reports and heard parents at school board meetings who don't want their white, children who are students feeling bad about themselves. Well, guess what? You actually want to use CRT then, because it's a systems approach. It's not about individual blame. And so, if it's about systems, that means that we're all a part of it. And most often, people who are addressing race theory and systems, they believe, for the most part, that we need to solve them together. And so you actually you should be at the schools asking for CRT, and most of the time that's never taught, by the way, but you should be asking for it as a tool to help understand the system that we all find ourselves in. So years and years ago, I used to teach something called total quality management, or as later called continuous improvement, as a tool for making, a product or a system, in my case, better. And, it was a great system. It's what helped a lot of the Japanese automakers, the stellar brands they have, such as Toyota and Honda, et cetera, and Mitsubishi, and lots of things like that. So this sort of systemic approach to things is something that's that creates a better system, if you will, by using it. So I just wonder when a fair critique became a bad thing. Jesus was constantly critiquing the systems of his day, and his critique can be levied against us as well. And I think Jesus is a good example of someone who used a systems approach. In 2020, Bo Sanders and I published a book called Decolonizing Evangelicalism. In that book, we discuss race theory and CRT, and we exemplify it and show how Jesus was constantly critiquing the systems in his own reality. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Randy. Robin? So just to sum up from what I've heard, that critical race theory and those who are skeptics of it or anti-CRT are fearful and concerned about the role of race and how race gets defined and how racism gets defined. It's a challenge to a legal theory. It's a challenge to a systems theory that looks at race in terms of institutions and policies. But it's now being used by the religious right as a political movement based on fear, possibly based on economics, based on racial privilege, to create a movement, to support a certain base, to maintain a certain system that privileges a few. So given that this concern about critical race theory, how do you use critical race theory in your own work? And that's our next question. How is it valid and useful as Christians in your own setting? How's it critical? Well, let's start. How's it critical to your faith? Why is understanding race, why is critical race theory helpful for your own pursuit of Jesus and to be followers of Jesus? We'll start with Randy, then Lisa.
Okay. Okay. So I want to make a distinction here, because I think we're such our Christianity has become so platonically dualistic. I want to define, when you say, how's it helpful to my faith? I don't have a faith that I carry around with me. I live a life of faithfulness. In other words, my faith isn't ancillary. It's not something I carry around and I draw from when needed. It is who I am at the core of my being. And it boils down to, loving my neighbor as myself. I mean, that's the simplest explanation for me. And what does that mean to love my neighbor? That means, if you think of the word love, another great substitution for that word is the word prefer. I prefer my neighbor as I do myself. I prefer that I brush my teeth at night. I prefer that I have a bed to sleep in. I prefer that injustice isn't enacted against me. And I also prefer that for my neighbor. And so that's just simply caring. And to go a step farther, in Isaiah 61, it says, I, the Lord, love justice. I hate wrongdoing. And so if you're trying to find out what's wrong with the system that hurts other people, you are doing exactly what Jesus taught. But if you're coming against that system, you may be coming against God. You may be like taking a stand for the enemy. So I think we need to be really careful about when we latch on to these things. Jesus comes in the world to destroy evil systems, not evil people, but evil systems, and to recreate those in shalom. He taught a shalom kingdom, if you will. He didn't use that word kingdom, but he taught a world and a reality of shalom. Shalom transforms evil systems. Sometimes I call it structured love, full of safety nets and just laws for the whole community of creation, including people and the earth. And it reaches into our realities where we become instruments of Creator's love to transform economic systems and political systems and educational systems and social systems and religious systems and ecological systems, etc. Because this is what the teachings of Jesus are about. This is the meta narrative, if you will, from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation, is to bring a reality of shalom to the world. And so we need to be really careful when we start critiquing things that help get rid of evil, and we call what is good evil.
So good.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you. Thank
Lisa?
you so much for that. And thanks, Russell. Really appreciate both of you. I want to start just by saying that my latest book, Fortune, really is an outpouring, an outgrowth of my last book, The Very Good Gospel, which is about shalom, exactly what Randy was just talking about. So I have to start with the question of shalom and what it is in order to answer your question, why CRT is important to my work. When you ask the question of what is the vision of God for the kingdom of God, for the reign of God, the vision of God is shalom. The vision of God that God presents in the scripture, and you see it all the way throughout the scripture, most clearly in Genesis 1. And Genesis 1, what you see is an epic Hebrew poem where the writer of Genesis 1, or writers, what they do is they declare that all humanity has the image of God inside of them, which is it's really a revolutionary moment, because in that moment, it's the first time in civilization, in the history of any civilization, that the image of God has been placed inside of all humanity. It's usually just in the kings and queens, the 1%, right? But here, these priests who are exiting Babylon, or Moses exiting Egypt, they declare for the first time that power is democratized. Power and dignity are spread out for all. Now, one of the implications of that actually comes with the next breath of that text, where it says, and let them have rada, which is dominion. It is stewardship of the world. Let them have agency in the world. Let them have the ability to protect the world, their ability to cultivate the world, the ability to serve the world, this rest of the creation that I have made. Now, that is pretty amazing that God actually, first of all, gives us co-dominion with God to do this, but also that every single human being, what it means to be human, is to be given the call to exercise stewardship of the world. Now, with that as our basis, we understand then that our world has endured the fall, which is the crash of all of those relationships through the most consistent thread that you find from the beginning to the end, from Genesis, the first page, to the last page of Revelations, is domination. Sin, at the core of sin, the pattern of sin that we see in Scripture, domination is it. And one of the things we know is that the governance that we have employed throughout our world, especially we see it in colonization, and that begins in the 14th chapter of Genesis. Again, 14th chapter of the entire Bible, we begin to see the question of colonization in the world. And we see with colonization comes war. And with war comes death, mass death. Now, we've already seen death in Genesis 3, where God has to kill one of God's own creation in order to cover over our sin. And then we're driven from the land where the tree of life is. So death is going to enter the world. And we see it also when Cain rises up against Abel. But when we get to war, that's where you're talking about masses, thousands, even millions. We know now, since we have experienced the Shoah, the Holocaust, and all that came around it, millions of images of God can be crushed on earth within years, within a blink of an eye, in the span of the eternity of time. And we also know that the image of God is not only meant to be a marker of where God rules, but it's also an indicator of the health of the kingdom of God. Wherever you see images of God crushed or pulverized or eliminated or covered over, you actually know there is war against that king happening in that kingdom. So I believe that when God sees us govern in ways that crush, cover over, or pulverize, or eliminate the image of God on earth, what God sees that as is as a declaration of war against God. Now that is what led me to write Fortune, because what I wanted to know is how has this war against God for supremacy impacted my family, impacted my people? And when it came down to it, I looked up and I had written a book that really proves it's critical race proof. I didn't even mean to do that. When I started the book, I hadn't read my first book on critical race theory. I only heard it whispered in those, conservative evangelical circles. Oh, that's critical race theory. Nobody ever explaining what that is. But I just wrote a book about my family. I just wrote about the very first race laws that Fortune Game McGee, my likely 7 times great grandmother, experienced the terror of those laws and the shaping of those laws over her life and the lives of her descendants to multiple generations, actually all the generations. I just wrote a book about Leah Ballard, who was enslaved in South Carolina and suffered the end of Reconstruction, where at the end of Reconstruction, South Carolina passed a law that said Black people can only work in 2 industries in our state. And so they are the ones who racialized work. We didn't racialize it. They racialized it when they created a law that said Black folk can only work in 2 industries. You know what those 2 industries were? Slavery, as in the fields, and domestic labor. Does that remind you of anything? They were trying to rebuild slaveocracy after the end of Reconstruction in that period of 9 years when we had 2,000 people elected into public service, up to the senators and House representatives and lieutenant governors and mayors and judges. And literally within a decade, all of them were pushed out at the end of Reconstruction. We were only in South Carolina able to work in the fields and as somebody's housemaid. So who racialized the world? They did. And now you can't do that and then try to erase your footsteps. Your footprints are all over my body. Your footprints are all over my ancestors' bodies and our lives. The only reason I'm sitting here in Philadelphia right now is because my great grandmother migrated in the Great Migration with 7 million other people of African descent and moved to Philadelphia in order to escape that terror. So the very place I'm living right now is because you racialized the world. So I will leave it at that, but thank you very much.
Thanks. Soong-Chan?
Thank you, both. I teach at the seminary in the area of practical theology. It's better than impractical theology, so I'm glad I teach practical theology. And the idea of practical theology is applied theology. You take theological concepts and apply them correctly and appropriately, hopefully. And one of the first steps in practical theology, applied theology, is that you do an analysis or clarification of the social reality. And without it, your theology is impractical. It just kind of stays there in the realm of the theoretical and doesn't move into the realm of the applied and the practical. So to me, critical race theory is part of that analysis. It sheds light on the truth of our social reality. And that's a very important first step, or a significant step forward when we talk about how do we make sure our Christianity actually makes sense to the world rather than just among ourselves. So that would be my kind of basic approach to any kind of intellectual academic exercise, such as critical race theory, which is, I want to know about my world. I want the truth. I'm not going to deal with mythology. I'm not going to deal with some biased perspective on the history of race, the history of slavery, and to say, oh, that was good for America because, you know, it led to a great nation. I need the truth. I want the truth to be understood and truth to be told. And therefore, the social analysis, the clarification is an important part of applied theology. And by the way, for evangelicals, this has been the norm for all of the evangelical history. This has been the norm. It's been the basic of our missiology. It's like we want to go learn the language before we start preaching the gospel, right? Because otherwise we're saying something that doesn't make any sense. Or we want to, when we start planning churches, we want to know about the neighborhood so that we're knowing the neighborhood and then we can plan churches that are appropriate. Well, critical race theory is the same thing. You want to know about the cultural context. You want to know about social reality. So for me, it's an important tool as part of the work of applied theology.
Randy started it off that what we want to do is avoid binaries, a colonized way of seeing the world, and develop a more holistic, integrated perspective. And if we don't separate our faith from action, if we don't separate our thinking from our heart, we see how each of you have spoken about how critical race analysis shapes both how we understand, how we love others, how we love ourselves, how we develop God's shalom, how we make theology relevant. And so I really appreciate that integration that for us as Christians, especially those of us who experience race in such powerful ways, that we need to integrate both our thought with our lives in following Jesus. And so that's why it's critical for us actually to include reflection, discussion, systematic thinking about race into our lives and into our faith. If we're trying to avoid the binaries, and I find I'm falling into that pitfall of saying it's us versus them, that there are anti-critical race theorists, and then we may be more pro use. If we want to avoid that pitfall of creating the other, of vilifying and pitting ourselves against our brothers and sisters, if we're going to deny our family, then how can we overcome this sort of seeming divide? Well, actually, it's a real divide. How do we overcome this polarization? How do we actually pursue Jesus's call to love, to steward, to be at peace, especially with our family? And so I think that's sort of the major question for us, is that we know how important critical race analysis is for ourselves and our own lives and to pursue Jesus faithfully, but we see others within our family coming from a different direction, having different assumptions, and driven possibly by different things, it seems like. So how do we come together? How do we dialogue? How do we, knowing and trying to develop empathy and compassion for a different perspective? How do we make peace? How do we repair? How do we come together? And so that's the tough $1 million question, I think, for each of you. And I think we'll start with anybody want to go first? Lisa?
Yeah, thank you so much, Russell. That is the $1 million question, isn't it? I think that that has to be grounded in story. That social sciences have actually now shown consistently in multiple different studies that people do not change based on stats and based on principles or based on even facts, quite honestly, because especially in today's world, they'll now question where your facts are coming from. But if you are able to ground your understanding in your story, the story of your own family, the story of families that are around you, that surround you, in the community where you live, well, then you actually have an opportunity. You have a chance, according to the science, to shift, to widen and shift worldview, to help people to see what they have not been able to see. And actually, that is one of the reasons why I wrote Fortune in the way that I did, because I knew that if I just came out with a book that was about reparations, calling for reparations, or even truth telling, that it would just be written off. It could just be written off as one of those liberal books, you know. But here, this is not. This is the story of my family. And one of the things that I call for toward the end of the book, in the last part of the book, is that all of us need to do this work. All of us need to do the work of deep genealogical research, asking the questions of who are we? Who is my family? What is my family story? How did my family come here to this land? If it was not as recent as someone who came in the last few decades, it might be harder for you to know, or maybe you don't know that. But it's actually not that hard to trace, especially if you're not African American. If you are almost any other people group, it's not going to be that hard to trace because you're very well documented on this land. If you are African American, you're usually well documented up to the Civil War. And then when you get past the Civil War, the vast majority of us were enslaved. And so it's much harder. But now we have DNA that can jump the shark, that can actually jump over the Middle Passage and tell us exactly where we were from and fill in more of that story. So I think in order for us to subvert the narratives that are spun, like Robin shared for us, that are spun in order to help confuse, like sow confusion, we clarify, and we actually we nullify chaos by learning our actual story and then sharing our actual story. Because those stories will be, for people of European descent, they'll be based in one of three ways they came here to this land. One, they came here because they were of the noble class that got granted land. And then you have to deal with the reality that all of the laws that were created, those race laws and everything since then, has been created in order to protect your power and your family's power. And maybe the reason why you're sitting in a C-class suite in a Fortune 500 company or at a major university is because you have that lineage that goes back to the nobles of Europe, the quote, nobles of Europe. But the vast majority did not come that way. They came because they were trying to escape oppression or poverty. And as you connect more to that history, guess what will happen? You'll be able to connect more with the history and experience of oppression and poverty of other people who have experienced that on this land. And you will likely have deeper roots, human roots, that are not so tied to this ghost called whiteness. And your value will not be tied to that as either.
Thanks, Lisa. So this approach of deep empathy has, like you said, has been research-based to help change people's hearts and minds. It's how we connect. And if we could share our stories, especially as people of color, then maybe people will understand the significance and role of race. Then the question is, will they listen? How do we share our stories so that they get heard and understand and accepted, right? Okay, Randy, how do you think we could bridge this dialogue gap, storytelling gap, way of thinking?
You're muted.
Sorry about that. That might be the better part of wisdom, is for me to stay muted. I'm not sure. So just a little bit of backing up and background. So one of the things CRT helps us with is to understand what people call the intersectionality, or the intersection of all oppressed peoples, right? So, and this is another thing that's sometimes people condemn with CRT, is to talk of intersectionality, right? So in other words, what's common among them? What's a common oppression? Well, CRT is one of the tools that you can use to sort of help figure that out. But it points to a number of things, including white supremacy. So white supremacy is, one of the products of I call an evil and deranged Western worldview, a worldview that is giving us limited time on this planet if we don't change it. White supremacy covers a lot of ground, but for now, I just want to focus on what I call white normalcy. So if white Western thought and cultural mores are the measurement of normal, which that's the attempt, then what does it say about everybody else who's just a little bit less than normal? Now, a creator's all about diversity, from the farthest multiverse to the smallest subatomic particle. Nothing is singular in the whole universe. In homeostasis, in other words, being the same and trying to stay the same, is always a temporary state of nature. It's never permanent. Nature adapts. But so when you try to maintain like all white standards or all whiteness, you're actually going against the very nature of how we were all created. So there's nothing singular or homostatic in the whole system that's been created for us. And so my wife and I, in part of our work and what we try to do, Edith, is to decolonize people's Western worldviews and convert them to a more indigenous worldview, because, and we would say that that's a much closer worldview to that Jesus and the people who wrote the scriptures have. And being peacekeepers, that's important work. That's what we're called to do. But we still always need to be honest about our own position. So do we look at them as us and them? No, but we have to say that difference is reality and to be honest about it. And so, CRT, this anti-CRT movement, has become a political foil for the extreme right. That's the reality. Part of it, is to plot a way that it can be used. I remember when it was used for climate change, right? So everybody was, there's no such thing as climate change and blah, blah, blah. And there were even, falsifications and false studies and all that kind of stuff, And so this is sort of the same thing. It's to prevent us from seeing something, and prevent us from, like climate change was to prevent us from taking the destruction of God's world seriously. So this relates to me very much like the gag rule in the 1840s and 50s, where Congress was not allowed to talk about slavery. Well, the problem doesn't go away if you don't talk about it. And that's exactly what's happening now. Anti-CRT is a gag rule so that people are not allowed to talk about the problem of a racialized system. So you can't build a house without tools. And this is one of the tools that people use to look at the whole thing. And so it's meant to keep people from seeing white supremacy, and it's meant to really politically to restore a white supremacist society. And this kind of Christian nationalism has always been present in American society. And it's what the extreme right is trying to bring back now. We live by our myths. I think our American mythology, the American mythology that we're taught from children and throughout all of our, markers throughout history, a lot of those are lies, but that's, I believe, the deepest held religion in America, is this religious fervor to live by the American myth. It's stronger than the pull of Jesus for most people, and they probably wouldn't admit that, but it's been my experience to see this. They think those times were great. So whether we have a Christian state or a Jewish state or an Islamic state, they all work against diversity and against democracy and God's very nature, which is social equity and equality. And that's what real freedom is. And so how do you do it? Lisa mentioned it. You destroy a bad narrative, which is exactly what the anti-CRT movement is, by telling a better narrative, by telling a better story. And we have a better story. Jesus told it. It's about shalom. So we have to accept our responsibility as followers of Jesus to tell a better story than the lies that are currently being told.
Thanks, Randy. It is seemingly demonic, right? That this anti-CRT movement really is a way to gag, to support Christian nationalism, white normativity, white normalcy, to deny our humanity, to deny our godliness, right? And should we be in dialogue with something so demonic? Should we try to share stories with something seemingly so entrenched in a lie and so satanic. So that's for you, Randy, is at what point do we say this isn't part of our family, this isn't an issue that we can actually bridge, but really we have to be prophetic. Soong-Chan?
Sure, nice to be, that's a great transition to me, to talk about demonic. So I think the interesting thing about this is confronting sin, confronting evil. And one of my professors used this phrase, we must confront evil in its proper geography. And it's true because he was an old white male professor, so it must be true. But it reminds us that in scripture, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities. And so for us to think about CRT and anti-CRT and all this stuff that's kind of out there now, as you described, Russell, a demonic power or whatever. I mean, I don't know what language to use, but it is interesting for us to kind of begin to process that from that perspective. And with that, I got to say that if that is the case, if white supremacy, and let's not talk about CRT, if white supremacy is a demonic power, and I do believe it is, that has completely upended the work of God in the world, or confronted the work of God in the world, if that is what white supremacy has done, then it is possible that the people that I find myself in contention with, white evangelicals or the religious right that are kind of advocating for these anti-CRT positions, are they also and I hate to use this word, but are they also victims of white supremacy? Has white supremacy clearly oppressed people of color, indigenous people, African American communities, but it hasn't been that great for white people either. And so again, our battle is not against flesh and blood. Our battle is against these powers and principalities. And, I think about how oppressive narratives traumatize people. It's clearly traumatized the Black community. You see this over and over again, the narrative of Nazi Germany and the extreme trauma, obviously the genocide of the Jewish people, and the same thing with the Native people, the genocide. So narratives, dysfunctional, evil, demonic ones, have the power to cause deep trauma. Now, again, it's a different type of trauma, and Mark Charles and I begin the process of this in our book. The idea that our perpetrators also experiencing a form of trauma, again, very different form of trauma, but it's still trauma. And I'm thinking, going back about a year ago to the January insurrection, please. When I saw Viking Man saying those evangelical prayers, I said, that's a traumatized brother. That is one traumatized person. And when I saw these folks like storming the Capitol building, saying these are deeply traumatized people. They have been traumatized by white supremacy. And so that's something that I'm kind of trying to think through, because if that's not true, if I can't figure this out, then the best thing to do is, as many of us have done, is wash our hands of it and walk away. I'm not sure I'm ready to do that. And the only way I can think to not do that is to not see this as a battle against flesh and blood, but against the powers and principalities, and the power and principality of white supremacy that leads to things like anti-CRT, that leads to things like white nationalism, American nationalism, all that, Christian nationalism. Those are the kind of things that I want to still keep fighting against. But is there a chance to continue to, in many ways, quell or diminish the demonic influences of that on others?
Okay, thanks, Soong-Chan. So if white supremacy is one of the principalities and powers that we're fighting against, not individuals, if that's the lie that's demeaning all of us, including white people, right? It's that white supremacy traumatizes all of us. And again, people of color could adopt white supremacy. We internalize that racism. We think in the same ways of white normativity. So we're all impacted by this racial trauma. We're all impacted by white supremacy. And if it's all about narrative, then how do we gain power and control over narrative, I guess, is how. And if we have a better narrative, then how do we share that better narrative? And that's what it seems to be I'm hearing from each of you. So if our battle is against principalities and powers, if our battle is against ways that of systems analysis, then we need to better organize ourselves and to think about as a body, as a system, as a group of people, and not just as individuals, how do we challenge, confront it? I appreciate what's been in the chat, that people have affirmed the role of narrative and the importance of our stories as a way to share a better, more powerful narrative. Other people in the chat have acknowledged that, yeah, it's clear that the fear, the reaction of a lot of the religious right is fear-based and trauma-based, right? That we're all going into fight or flight response. And so we're fighting among ourselves out of this fear. It's a triggered response that race has and white supremacy has impacted all of us negatively. So we're going to move to Q&A. So please put your questions and answers. This is your great opportunity to dialogue with our panelists here, and I'll read them off. To start off the discussion, I'll just invite our panelists. Do you have any sort of comments or reflections on what each other has said, or questions for each other?
I have a question for Robin. So I'm curious because you deal with the legality of these things much more than I do, or probably other people on this panel. Is it actually possible to, I mean, if you're not using like formal CRT, but you use an analysis that's similar, can you actually stop people from thinking and applying that in a job situation? So for example, part of the problem in the past has been sort of like white people in power and hiring other white peoples, and other people of color don't get hired, for example. So and so that would automatically go, any kind of system that privileged those who have not been served well. Wouldn't that go with any kind of CRT in that, because that would be called an analysis of a racialized system or something like that? How does this interplay in hiring and I guess from a legal aspect? My thing is like, how do we stop people from thinking a certain way who are trying to do good?
I think that when I approach that question, I immediately ask the strategic question, how do we move power? Bottom line, that's really the basic question. How do we move power? And I mean, as we've been doing consulting work in this area of racial healing and diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging, it really has to happen literally on every level simultaneously. So there is the working out of individual biases through reading other people's stories, again, like assigning books, assigning especially narrative books, assigning movies to watch, assigning basically any kind of immersive experience. You know that we love pilgrimage because pilgrimage is the most powerful way to do that, to immerse yourself in the story of the other. But then there also has to be systemic and structural. In fact, that's actually at the core, systemic and structural change. And that has to, in order to get that in any organization or institution or field, people first have to understand how they have been part of the problem. They have to understand, they have to have self-awareness about where they are in their own journey, seeing where they are in relationship to others that are also on this journey. That really does help, so that they don't center their own experience of the world as the experience of the world, but they can see other organizations, other networks, other fields, other communities that have actually taken steps and written about it or thought about it, and see, oh, okay, so we're not quite there yet, but then they can see where they're going. And personally, as I've been moving and teaching and writing on this, particularly around fortune, the last pages of the book actually they cast that vision. I do believe that people of European descent have to understand that they lost something in this bargain. They lost. That's my dog. There you go. She's here. Her name is Babe. She's wonderful and she loves to have a say. So they lost humanity, because whiteness and blackness both dehumanize. no, babe, you can't. This is not about you. So, whiteness and blackness both dehumanize. And because they both lift us outside of our own stories, our families, our narratives, our cultures, our religions, and they make us live only in relationship to of power. How much power do we have? And if your whole identity is based on how much power you have, then you will scale the walls, on January 6th, because you see that you're about to lose power. You see it. The demography is clear. You're going to lose power in the next 23 years. It's going, meaning we will not be assumed that you are the leader. But if you can ground yourself again in your actual story, then and also in the stories of others, then there's a possibility for movement of worldview and heart.
Yeah, and I'm
And John,
contractually obligated right now to use the word lament, and lament as the appropriate response. And so that's on both the individual and the corporate structural level. But what if those who have been traumatized on all levels were to lament along with each other? And how would that transform our narratives? Because part of lament is hearing other narratives and then lamenting alongside. And so I think there's, again, a very significant biblical spiritual practice that we've missed because our eyes have been blinded by nationalism and by white supremacy.
thanks, Randy. You want to add to this? Yeah, you raised the question.
Well, no, I'm just, because, I have to do, because I've got one more year in the academy here, and I'm always having to do training about diversity and inclusion and all that kind of thing. And I'm thinking like, at the same time, there's this anti-CRT movement. Well, all of that stuff will go by the wayside if those folks had their way, So that's what raised the question.
Yeah, it's a pertinent question for a lot of us. I actually got banned, right? I used to give talks to federal employees, and because I deal with race during the last year of the Trump administration, I couldn't give those talks. I was actually banned by our own government to discuss issues of race. So, so some of the questions, and you could pick whatever you wanted. We know the power of narrative and God's story, Jesus' story intertwined with our story. How have you seen a great example of how you've been able to shift another person's perspective, or maybe your own perspective was shifted by theirs? And then how have you seen an example of institutions being changed, which is for me another big question. It's easier to address people on the individual level, but to change systems that seem so set in policies, centuries of racialized structures. How does God work in that? And I guess my third question, okay, narrative changing individuals, institutions. How do we not fall into the trap of using worldly power, or maybe God uses worldly power to make change? And how can we access? Is there a different source of power through prayer that we need to better access to make change? So I guess if we're going to make institutional change, do we need to use the powers that be in this world to make institutional change? And is there another way to make change through Jesus? So these are my $1 million questions. So thank you for allowing me to ask.
By the way, it used to be a $10,000 question, but apparently inflation's up. So yeah.
I'll jump in. I think that here's the thing. I think that as we begin to ask the question of, how do we make change? That $1 million question, which really is inflation, we also have to take into consideration our context, our political context, the reality that there are multiple kinds of power that are moving. There's not only political power, but there's religious power. There is economic power. There's social power, and there's moral power, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of power that are moving in this moment. And when moral power is silent, or spiritual power neglects to pray, or religious power becomes captive to political and economic power, which is really exactly where it's been. Most of the pastors don't teach on race, not because they don't believe it, but because they're afraid of losing money. They're afraid of losing their tithe. And the economic power, we can understand right now the reason why we do not have a fixed Voting Rights Act today is because of economic power that has been leveraged against one senator. Well, two, I don't really know her connection to it, but definitely Senator Manchin. It's his economic interest. It's in his economic interest to drive America off the cliff of fascism. Literally, it's in his economic interest. And so that is why we do not have a fixed Voting Rights Act right now. So I think it's important for us to understand how power is moving among us, to understand which power is speaking and moving us at particular times. This is something that you will absolutely hear from Alexia Salvatierra, who teaches later on today. And so I don't want to teach that course. She's going to do that, and she does that for a living. So I'm going to let that be her thing. But I do just want to say that, yes, we need to pray. Absolutely. I remember Dr. Alice Brown Collins saying to us as we were back when I was in my InterVarsity days, saying to us as we were mounting a strategy for racial reconciliation within InterVarsity, you better have a prayer strategy. What's your prayer strategy? You got to have a prayer strategy, because this is not just about flesh and blood, right? This is about the principalities and powers, just like Soong-Chan said. So most of us actually do not operate with a prayer strategy. And I think part of the reason why we are where we are is because that's true. We haven't actually lived as if God is real, and as if God actually moves mountains. That said, I do think that what we tend to do is we tend to bury our heads in the sand and also not employ a political strategy, which is another legitimate force of power. And it is the force of power that is ultimately used to confine and define bodies of color. So if we don't engage the political realm, then that is to our demise.
Well, back to the second question, I think it is, and this is just a really simple answer, is that, there's an old adage in anthropology that says that I don't know who invented the idea of water, but it probably wasn't a fish, because a fish doesn't probably realize it's swimming in water. Because that's all the fish knows. And so sometimes it's easy to take it outside of the system in which people are in and show another system where something similar is going on. And so I've seen that happen. I remember when the movie Rabbit Proof Fence came out, and it was all about the boarding schools in Australia that kidnapped Aboriginal children and beat them and sexually abused them and all those kinds of things. And I remember friends of ours going to those and going, oh, this is so terrible. What happened? I can't believe they did that in Australia, and blah, blah. And then sharing with them, well, the exact same thing happened here. And they were able to see the history of the United States in a different light than they probably ever could have if I would have just said, this is the kinds of things that went on here. A lot of people, I've done that many times, and they don't believe it, right? But when you see it in a different reality, sometimes it hits home, and you start making the connection. So that's one way you can do it.
Thanks. Any other suggestions on bridging that narrative gap of using power well?
I'm going to tag on to what I said real quick, because these guys are too slow. So, and this is all I have to say. But yes, one of the suggestions I do for white people all the time, and I see this as one of the questions later on, and that is to say, you have to make yourself uncomfortable. You need a set of goals to be uncomfortable. Put yourself in uncomfortable situations where white people are not in charge and don't have a say, because all of a sudden a whole different world starts opening up. And I've had students who, for years argued with me about these kinds of things. And then they became like a missionary in this situation. And then they were disempowered. And then they write me and say, oh my gosh, everything you said is starting to ring true for me now. I'm starting to understand. So one of the highest values for American white folks is to be comfortable. And so make yourself uncomfortable.
Soong-Chan, you're next. Let me just put in a little commercial. If you want to join E4J and continue these types of discussions, please join and sign up on the chat. There's a link for where you can sign up. And if you want to donate for the stimulating conference, please donate, and the link is in the chat. Soong-Chan?
Yeah, I was just going to say, there are times that I can be cynical. It's very rare. It doesn't happen often, but there are times that I can be really cynical. And that's where it's so challenging, because the right thing to do on this side of it, right? To say, hey, we want to have compassion. We want to have, care for those who are not seeing it in a way that, that we want them to see. We want them to have the fullness of the gospel. We want them to have the fullness of the experience of who Jesus is. And that includes the Jesus of justice as well as Jesus, a person of salvation. Those are things that, I feel I was a pastor at one point. Those are things that didn't, go away when I moved into the academy. At the same time, I think all of us on this call in some form or another will admit to a fatigue that we've been at this for quite some time. And I think for many of us who, especially over the last 5 years, maybe as the marker, I did see movement for 25 years. A lot of us have been in this for decades now. For 25 years, we saw slow, gradual, small movements, and then it seemed to have just completely reversed over the last 5 years. And that's where it's kind of very disquieting, and the cynicism rises up. But I do want to go back, and Robin pointed this, where are the leverage points that seem to have worked? So one place that I saw, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but I saw a movement on the mommy blogger front, where you saw like white moms writing about their experience raising Black kids. I mean, it was really interesting stuff. And that actually did move the needle a little bit within that community. I'm trying to think through, and then I'm working on a book right now, and we're going to try to call it like biblical race theory, and say, okay, you all think the Bible is the same. Well, then let's do that. Let's go with that leverage point and say that's your leverage point. Then let's actually tell you the same things that critical race theory might teach you, but draw it from the Bible. So it is a matter of not giving up and saying, okay, I'm not going to give into my cynicism, give into my discouragement, and continue in this, but also keep looking for those leverage points where the needle does move at some points.
Thanks. I think I remember I was with Soong-Chan one election night, and we were mourning and lamenting that clear change where we went into exile, where we really saw that shift in the polarization and the rhetoric and the decline. So we're going to wrap up, and again, just for the audience to know, if you want to continue this discussion, we're going to have a breakout room after this, and then at noon, and Robin and Randy are going to share from their books again about what they've been writing about and thinking about. So be prepared for that. And what I want to do now is, before we close, invite the panelists to just give maybe one last word of encouragement of how we can again bridge the divide.
Final words. We need to change. A lot of people are always asking the same question, which is and I saw this one on here several times in the chat, how do people convince their relatives who believe the exact opposite, and that sort of a thing. And so, somebody's gonna have to confront the situation and bring intelligent conversation there, and or bring them to a place where all of a sudden things change, and because they are in a new situation, a new experience. And so, but most people only change when they're, it's some sort of a transitional place in their lives. And this is a pretty transitional place that we are in society right now. So I think if we can just get people open to talking, there's dialogue that I do with people who believe the things that we're talking about, who believe the exact opposite. And every now and then I get ticked off and say, well, don't, as yesterday I said to a good friend, don't ask me if you don't want my answers. And he said, I'm still trying to dialogue. And I'm like, okay, sorry. Yeah, I forgot we're dialoguing here. So, you just stay at the table.
Amen. And I'll add another element of that, which is don't try this yourself. Don't do this yourself. And be in a community that you can find the encouragement. And right here on this call, you all have been friends and colleagues in this for years. And, we knew each other back in the day. Like, I used to endorse Russell's books. He doesn't need my endorsement anymore. He doesn't ask me for that because, but that's great that we're at this place where we would support each other and encourage each other in that work. And this kind of community, E4J, and these places have been, without them, I don't think any of us would have survived. So don't try to do this alone.
Of the colonization of the church. When you had people pray on the floor of the House of Representatives, and at the same time hunt for Nancy Pelosi and for other members of Congress to kill them, and have already killed 5 people in that day. And so that's the core. The core is that we need to decolonize. In other words, take the death grip of white supremacy, Western supremacy, off of this brown, colonized, indigenous text, and begin to see Jesus for who he really was, brown, colonized, indigenous Jesus, who proclaimed in his very first address, I've come for the oppressed. I've come with good news for the poor, to set the oppressed free. And no, that did not mean spiritually oppressed. No, that did not mean spiritually poor. The year he was born, 500 of his neighbors were crucified per day, every day, for several days by one general, because they tried to fight back against white supremacist empire. So until we actually study the scripture with those who live on the underside of empire, on the underside of hierarchies of human belonging, we will continue to get it wrong, and we will continue to have January 6 moments.
Thanks. All the panelists. I have been really blessed and honored to join you all. And I just actually want to wrap up with some of the 4 things that I've heard. First, we really have to name the enemy, to use scriptures and to use race theory to understand the colonization process, white supremacy, intersectionality. And with this diagnosis, we recognize it's not necessarily individuals who are enemies, but they are systems, they are powers, they are principalities. And maybe as we change the narrative, maybe we can come up with better names that connect with people. And maybe it's the names that make people shirk when we use terms like white privilege or white supremacy or white normativity. Maybe anything with the word white in front of it is problematic for some people. Secondly, I've heard we need to embody the narrative. We need to act faithfully and live out. If we're going to think that we have a fuller understanding of the gospel, we felt the freedom of Jesus, then let's live it out, let's embody it, so that people would want that greater narrative, that people would see the freedom that we've received and come alongside, enable them to come and see, enable them to taste and see God's goodness as we live out Jesus's decolonized gospel. They're like Soong-Chan said, I think we don't do it alone, and that we need each other, and that we have to come together and really find support in those of us who share this this desire to share this prophetic voice, to share a way of being like Jesus. And so join E4J, be the church. And as we are the church, then let's think of those organizing strategies. Let's use E4J as an organizing mechanism to make that change on that institutional level. And finally, I just want to pray. I think if you want to be an activist, you pray, because that's, for me, the greatest form of activism. What's more than seeking Jesus as your advocate? What's more than pursuing the high judge in heaven? So I want to just close out by spending a moment of silence, of lament, and then I'll bless us. Please join us in a breakout session. It's in the chat. And if not, you can rejoin us at noon on this link, as Robin, Randy, and Lisa will share from their book, as well as Rob Dalrymple. So let's take a moment of silence to lament and to seek God in this time. Jesus, we see how we've all been traumatized, damaged, crashed by systems and powers that be, that deny the Imago Dei, that deny our full humanity. And we're broken in really painful ways that have led to death, that have led to mass incarceration, mass detention, mass shootings, destruction of our creation. And we mourn all that and seek you. We seek your justice, we seek your shalom, we seek your love in the midst of this. Thank you that we could come together to mourn together, to lament, and to be blessed by each other, by your people. We pray that we can stand and embody who you are and our relationship with you and the creation. Thank you. As we get sent out, may we be your voices, may we be your hands and feet, may we be your hearts and minds in a broken world. Amen. Thanks, everyone. See you in the breakout room, or see you at noon. And then after our book session, Alexis Salvatore will be talking about putting our faith in action and community faith-based organizing. So stay tuned for that as well.